Welcome to the Women's March Canada podcast, making the equality of women in Canada the new norm. This is episode 33, entitled Parenting, Community, and Adversity. My name is Leanne Castellino, and I'm your host, uniting, inspiring, and leading the charge for the advancement of women across Canada. Please welcome our guest this week, Anne Douglas. Anne is a best-selling author, a journalist, content creator, and a speaker. Her books have focused primarily on pregnancy and parenting, and she's also the mother of 4. Welcome, Anne, and thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's great having this conversation.
So I wanted to ask you, first of all, what led you down the specific path of authoring books on this subject matter of pregnancy and parenting?
Right. Well, I guess I had sort of an extra challenging journey to motherhood and through motherhood. I mean, back in the earliest days when I knew I wanted to become a mother, I had difficulty conceiving. And then I had 3 quote unquote textbook pregnancies, whatever that happens to mean. And then I had a miscarriage, and then I lost what would have been my 4th child through stillbirth. So that was a really devastating experience. And I remember coming home from the hospital and opening up my pregnancy books, and the message I kept giving was, don't worry about stillbirth. It hardly ever happens to anybody, but that's a pretty awful, lonely message to get when it just happened to you. So I decided right then I really wanted to write pregnancy books that were more inclusive of all the possibilities, everybody's experience. And so that's sort of what led me on the path. And then along the way, I had 4 really interesting children. My youngest is on the autism spectrum. All 4 of them have ADHD. Various ones have struggled with mental health challenges or a learning disability and so on. So we were dealing with a lot of stuff as a family. And again, when I looked at a lot of really mainstream pregnancy media, I was getting the message that if your child is struggling, it's because you're doing it wrong. And I really wanted to push back against that message because I know so many really talented, lovely, caring parents who just happen to be dealing with a particular struggle in their families. And, it's not like when your child has a physical illness. One of my kids also lives with Crohn's disease. And I've never sat there and said to myself, oh, the Crohn's disease was probably the result of bad parenting or the genes I happen to pass along to this child. There was never that same kind of sense of worry, guilt, self-blame. So I really feel that as parents, we have to push back against some of that is often pinned on us by default. And I don't think that's fair or reasonable.
So much to get into there. But the overriding question for me, one of the first ones anyways, is, going through something is one thing. Having that experience is one thing. When you go through all these intensely personal experiences involving your children and your family, and then want to share those things,
yes,
that's a whole different ballgame. So what tweaked that in your mind to say to yourself, I went through this, but I also want to share it?
Well, I think there were a couple of things that happened. The first was that, like, when I think back to the stillbirth, for example, I felt like I was at this crossroads in my life and that I sort of had a choice. I could let this experience ruin my life and, just shatter my faith in the universe, or I could find a way to try to make something positive come from it. And I decided that because I'm a writer, the way I could make something positive come from it was to write about this experience and to help to support other parents who might be dealing with similar things. When it came to sharing about my family's mental health struggles, that was a little harder because I was very conscious of the fact that this wasn't just my story, this was my entire family's story. So I did it in a really conscious and deliberate way. I interviewed the kids for the book so that they knew what would and wouldn't be shared, because I was very conscious of the fact that as their mom, I am privy to a lot of information that the rest of the universe doesn't have, and I didn't want to violate that trust. But as we talked about it as a family, we decided that yes, we would be judicious about what we shared, but we also wanted to put ourselves out there to sort of say, this can happen in any family, even a family that is really passionate and committed to one another. And, the week before my book came out, Parenting Through the Storm, I remember feeling a little bit sort of nervous and butterfly-ish, thinking like, what if I've ruined everybody's life? So one day I obsessively opened the book and I counted how many pages were actually about my family. And in a book that's like about 300 pages, there were only actually 9 pages about my family. So then I was able to sleep at night. But once the book was out there, I started hearing from so many other parents who've been through these struggles, and they kept saying things like, it was such a relief to know it wasn't just us. And that made it all worthwhile. So I really, feel incredibly grateful to my family to have been willing to, to share their stories with other people in the hope of at least providing that reassurance and that, unifying message. And if I'd had the book be just about them, that would have been, I think, too much for us. But the fact that I interviewed 50 other families and brought forward their stories, I felt like I was part of a community that was sort of stepping forward together and saying, we need more support, and we are passionately committed to our kids, and it shouldn't be this hard.
Yeah. The other thing that's really striking to me, listening to you speak and sort of having done some research here, is in many ways you were talking about these subjects when they were still not in the mainstream. They were, almost kind of taboo. So now you're talking about things that the vast majority of people really can't relate to. So how did you go about navigating that, if at all?
Right. I think in the early days, I was just mad. I was just really mad that I was feeling like my experience was being excluded on the stillbirth front. And I just thought, you know what, this needs to change. And, and it wasn't even just about the stillbirth thing. It was about the fact that I had trouble conceiving, and the fact that I could see other parents having different kinds of pregnancy experiences. And it's something I challenge myself with each and every book. I mean, the fact that I've just finished writing a brand new parenting book, when I was going out to find the families to interview for that book, I made a really conscious effort to try to look for stories that weren't being told in mainstream media, because sometimes the people who step forward and get quoted time and time again are relatively privileged people who may or may not have had certain kinds of struggles. So in my new book, you'll see the voices of families that are dealing with really challenging experiences, and also families who are dealing with like garden variety stuff that anybody can relate to. And, families that are on such limited incomes, you wonder how they're scraping by, and families that have faced like a medical crisis, the whole thing. Because I feel like if I open a pregnancy book or a parenting book and all I see is somebody with a completely fortunate set of circumstances, it doesn't just make me feel lonely, it can make me feel invisible. And I don't want to do that to another parent. So yeah, I'm a little bit passionate about this particular issue because I think we're going through an important cultural moment where we're thinking through these issues deeply. So I know inevitably my book will be a bit skewed by my experience because that's the lens through which I see the world, but I can do everything in my power to try and compensate for that by inviting other people to the table to share their stories as well.
But it's also through your experience, that whole piece that strengthens everything that you're saying. You're speaking from the first person. So it's not like, other people can't relate or you can't relate
right.
to. When we talk about feedback, you talk about being struck by the feedback you've received. I'm interested to know what kind of feedback has struck you in particular that you've received from other women and mothers in particular.
Right. I think when I look back over my parenting author career, which is now, into a couple of decades, there's this one moment that always really stands out for me. And I was at the show, like one of those baby shows that are huge, like 20, 30,000 people come through the doors over the course of a weekend. And it can feel like you're in the midst of a hurricane talking to all these people. And I remember there was this one couple that came up to my booth, and they stood back a little bit and they were looking at, I think it was like the Mother of All Pregnancy books or something. And they said to me, "We read one of your earlier books and it really helped us a lot." And it was something about the look on their face, and I knew they must have been talking about my book, Trying Again, which is about trying again after stillbirth or the death of a child. And so I started to talk to them, and yes, it had been that book. And they started talking about how the book had given them the courage to try again after the death of their child. And they started crying, and I started crying. And it was one of those moments that will stay with me forever because it really underlined the whole reason that I write books. And that is to try to make that connection with the reader so that I feel less alone and they feel less alone. And it was just a really magical moment. And when I'm speaking in schools these days about, mental health struggles and the family's journey and supporting a child who's struggling, almost inevitably, after I finish speaking, somebody will come up after the rest of the group has gone home and they'll start sharing their story, and then they'll start crying. And then they'll say, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to cry. I thought I could hold it together. But what those people don't know is that those moments of vulnerability are what it is worth. Like, that's what the whole thing is worth. The whole reason I write these books is to have those moments of connection with people. And it is such a privilege to have those conversations with readers and to carry forward the stories of other parents in my books. And that's why I do this. I mean, there are times my accountant over the years has asked me, why do you do this? Well, it has nothing to do with what shows up on a balance sheet at the end of the year, because sometimes the case could be made that I'd be better off doing almost anything else on the planet, but this is the work that I'm called to do, and this is how I make my contribution. So there you go. That's a pretty long-winded answer to your question.
Well, it's a very powerful answer, right? Because, I mean, when you think about all the things that you've been through, it might sound like the description of several people, but it's you. So I'm wondering, how has all of that adversity impacted the way that you mother and parent?
Right. I think very much through a lens of empathy and compassion for the fact that I haven't been a perfect parent, my kids haven't been perfect kids, and that makes sense because we're mere humans. This is the material we were given. So I don't have to second guess everything I ever did or said. They don't have to feel guilty. It's like we're journeying and learning this stuff together. And it's also about really learning to treat yourself with self-compassion. I mean, I can think of entire decades of my life when I was really, really hard on myself. And that just makes everything so much more difficult. So I'd say that the learning I've done in the past 5 years or so in my life as a human being has been transformative. And every day I'm excited to get up and think about what else am I going to figure out about myself and about the world. I mean, I've got to such a happy, healthy place in terms of better self-care and in terms of practicing self-compassion. I mean, an example from a couple of years ago, we had a house fire at our house and we had about $150,000 worth of damage. And we were out of our house for 9 weeks one summer, and it was incredibly stressful for all concerned. And when that happened, I was able to say two things to myself. First of all, I've been through worse. Nobody died. The baby photos were fine. So the essential things were covered off. And so I know through past experiences I've lived through, I've built up the resilience and the ability to deal with difficult things. The second thing I told myself is that I needed to cut things down to the bare essentials for the next little while. I was supposed to be working on the revisions to the US edition of one of my books. And I got in touch with my editors and I said, you know what? This summer is going to be about treading water. It's going to be about taking good care of myself. It's going to be about supporting my family. And I have to put things on hold for a couple of months. Bear with me. We'll get over this. And we did. But in the past, I would have told myself, you have this commitment to your publisher. You have to soldier through no matter what. And I would have gotten completely burnt out and depleted. So it took me about 5 decades to figure this stuff out. So if anybody's like merely 3 decades in and they're feeling like they're behind schedule, not at all. It does take time to figure some of this stuff out. But when you can get to that place of self-kindness and self-acceptance, it is just an amazing feeling. And I mean, you probably know, because you've known me for a long time, you have seen me adapt and adopt different kind of lifestyle habits. And I mean, I've learned how to prioritize good food and relaxation and adequate sleep and my daily walks. This is when, of course, I have to show off my fitness tracker. And I've just made those things sort of the backbone to daily living. And that has made all the difference. I guess what I didn't realize for a very long time is that I needed to work really hard at managing my anxiety, and that if I could do that through healthy living, that opened up a whole new world of energy and possibilities. This is sounding awfully new age, which isn't me at all, but really it is about that kindness and self-care.
So let me ask you this. What, if anything, would you do over?
I wouldn't have been so hard on myself for so long. You know how when you get to sort of like midlife, I don't even know if we're calling it that, but whatever, this sort of middle of the life stage, sometimes you look back on photos of yourself in younger moments. And a couple years ago, I was on Facebook and a friend posted a photo of a grade 8 trip to the lake where we'd all been together. And when I had thought of myself in my head over the years of me as a grade 8, I thought, oh, I was so overweight, I was hideous, I was, blah, 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 all these negative things. And when I saw the picture of that young woman sitting on a picnic bench, the first thing I thought was, I was not hideous. And the fact that that was the first thing that came to mind was a stunning revelation for me. And I looked closer and I thought, this is just a quiet, intelligent, thoughtful young woman who hasn't quite found ease in the world yet. But there's nothing wrong with her. She's not defective. And that made me realize I had seen myself through that lens for so long. And then I felt quietly joyous because I realized I don't see myself through that lens anymore. In fact, sometimes when I'm going to, to do TV things or something, they'll have a beautician who gets assigned to the challenge of my hair. And one time, this person used 3 hair products and like this steamer to try and steam out the curl and stuff. And it was actually hurting my head because it's like they were almost like blasting my head with steam. And I thought, I am so over that stuff. It's like, if you don't want somebody with bionically curly hair, don't invite me on your show.
I've never heard hair described like that. No, that's a great.
Because you may not have seen this live in the current humidity.
Oh yes, there's a humidity factor always. So how would you say then that you have gone about, probably maybe not deliberately, but very quietly empowering women through your work?
I have a lot of conversations with women. I'm very active on social media. I would say Twitter more than anything. In fact, I have a pretty open love-hate relationship with Facebook. It's both fascinates me and drives me crazy, so most of the time I stay away. But with Twitter, I feel like I can connect with other people who share my passion on a particular issue. And that is the best feeling, because no matter what it is that's happening in the world that has you upset, if you can find other people who are having those conversations and connect with them, you feel like there's enough good in the world pushing the ball in the right direction up the hill, as opposed to the ball falling back and knocking you back over again. So I'd say having a lot of those kind of conversations, and also taking inventory of the people in your life who really, really matter to you. And I made a conscious resolution at the start of the year that there were a couple of friends in particular that I wanted to visit with every month. And one friend is in Newfoundland and the other friend is in Vancouver. So it's not really convenient to sort of like hop on a plane and go see them in person. But what we do is we visit face-to-face once a month by Skype, so that way we can actually have that face-to-face conversation that isn't, me holding a cell phone while I'm stirring something in a pot or feeling like I have to do something else in the background. It's actually that kind of eye-to-eye focused conversation that you have face-to-face. And that has been the best thing, because I realized that sometimes social media makes us feel like we have to have like 10,000 or whatever thousand number of friends, when really we need a small circle of people who really matter to us. So I think sort of having those small focused connections and using that as a way to support the other work I'm trying to do by broader outreach through my writing, my speaking, or whatever.
You talk about in the last 5 years, you really focused on self-care. What was the tipping point that led to that for you?
It was a couple of things. I mean, I realized I was coming up to a milestone birthday, the 50th, and that can sometimes make you take stock of where you are. And I realized that my mom had only lived to be 63. And I thought, will 13 more years be enough for me on the planet? Absolutely not. I was thinking about my, my social justice agenda. It's like this could take decades. I cannot afford to exit early. And I realized I was 130 pounds overweight, and that was a significant risk factor for, for health issues for me down the road. I have a family history that's not great, with heart disease and diabetes and all kinds of good stuff. So, to say nothing of significant mental health challenges. And I thought, I really need to do all the things that are within my control to try to minimize some of those risk factors. So, so that's when I sort of started to make the change. And then there was, I think what I struggled with was I didn't want to give in to all the stigma that heavy people face in the world. I felt like if I lost weight, I might actually be giving into that pressure. And so I think that had kept me from wanting to deal with that issue for a very long time. I remember one time on an airplane in particular, it was one of those moments where you just think, humanity, what is wrong with you? And at that point, I was significantly overweight, and I had lost track of the time in the airport, and I'd had to sprint to the airplane to get up to my seat on time. When I finally got seated, this fellow who was sitting beside me said to me, I'm going to ask the stewardess if I can be relocated to another seat, because I think we'll both be more comfortable. And it was like this total rejection of me as a person, and so mean and so patronizing. And I just felt humiliated. So part of me said, never again do I want to be in that situation. But the other part of me said, why should I have to be the one who changes? Because I honestly think his stigma was more of an issue than my weight. But for all the different complicated reasons, I decided ultimately I did need to get to a happy, healthier place. And for me, what I hadn't anticipated were the mental health benefits of walking on a daily basis. My entire life, I had convinced myself that physical activity was a scam invented by gym teachers to trick you into being physically active. And it was just a horrible thing you only had to endure while you were a kid. And so I'd spent decades avoiding it, right? But when I realized that if I go for my 2 walks, which I do every day, sort of a walk at midday and then a walk in the evening, I feel so much calmer than I otherwise would. In fact, when I'm traveling and there's the odd day where getting in physical activity is just not a thing because of the number of hours I have to be in a car, I really feel it. And my husband would attest, he feels it too. It is a much better place, and I'm a much happier person if I get my walks in, which I'm fortunate enough to do, being a freelance writer who isn't always compensated in other ways. I at least am compensated with the gift of the flexibility over my own time.
Looking back on, on your life, and I'm sure you may have gone through this, taking stock of turning 50 and looking back, what would you say got you through all of that adversity?
I think I'm still a fairly optimistic and hopeful person. So what usually happens when a really bad thing happens is that I cry and I grieve and I sometimes get really angry. And then I take a breath and then I figure out, okay, now what? What do I need to do next? I'm lucky to have incredibly supportive family members and friends. I have 3 sisters who, we have like our own little sister net, we call it, where we, chat with each other on an ongoing basis. And I have other family members, including my husband and my kids, who are equally amazing and supportive. So I'm smart enough to know that when I'm feeling really flattened by a challenge, that I need to reach out for other people's support. And I'm also very resourceful. So like about 1.5 years ago, I was diagnosed with this balance and dizziness disorder, which is called Meniere's disease. And if you've ever had an attack of vertigo, you can feel a little woo-woo. Well, this is that on steroids. This is like to the max. It's like hours of vomiting while you try to regain your ability to figure which way is up in your head and in your world. Like, it's really, really debilitating. So when I first received the diagnosis, I was really upset, and I was really worried that my life was going to be over, because I have to limit my screen time. I've had to make some adjustments and so on to my life. And I was really worried about the potential impact on my family and my husband in particular, because he's looking forward to, to retirement. And I thought, what if his retirement is hanging out with somebody who's throwing up all the time? Well, that'll be a lot of fun. And he made the point that I love you. I'm committed to you. And this isn't just something you have to face by yourself. This is something we'll face together as a couple. And once I had that sense of acceptance from him, I realized I could take chances. I could go for treatment. I could do all kinds of things to try to be the healthiest person. So that's just, again, me being very long-winded at saying that tapping into support from other people is so important, because some of these journeys are too hard to make on your own. And if you can find other people who will be there to support you, and more importantly, other people who've been through it, you can be a tremendous source of inspiration and support to one another.
And Douglas, thank you so much for your time today. It has been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone tuning in today. Your comments are always welcome and encouraged. Please subscribe to the Women's March Canada podcast and receive updates every time we upload a new podcast. Our mission across Canada is to stand together in solidarity with our partners and children for the protection of our rights, our health, our safety, and our families, recognizing that our vibrant and diverse communities are the strength of our country. This is the Women's March Canada podcast. You can find us on Twitter at Women's March CDA and our website, womensmarchcanada.com. My name is Leanne Castellino. Thanks for joining us and have a great day.